We're standing in an exhibition called KESHIKI, the landscape within contemporary Japanese ceramics from the Brodfuehrer collection. My name is Hollis Goodall, and I'm the curator of the show along with the staff from the Japan House, including Trask Howard, Joshua Weeks, Haruhiko Sugimura, and Kentaro Shibayama, who laid out the exhibition in cooperation with Eileen Dickton. I'm talking today with Gordon Brodfuehrer, whose collection is on display here at Japan House, Los Angeles during the spring of 2019. The exhibition was laid out according to regions, so we moved from west to east across Japan from some of the sites that were developed as major pottery sites beginning in the 16th and 17th century, moving across central Japan where some of the kilns go back in time to the 12th and 13th century, and then to eastern Japan where there are some younger kilns and the major metropolitan district of Tokyo. The exhibition is filled with large photographs that Gordon selected from the work of a dealer in Tokyo of Bizen ceramics, Ito Taijiro. And Gordon, can you tell me something about how you selected these photographs and why?
Well, it was very serendipitous. I realized that Taijiro was this young John Muir who'd go out in the wilderness every weekend and pursue his passion for the beauties of Japanese nature and take lots of photographs. And he'd archived these photographs on his website going back a decade. So he must have begun this as a very young man. So I could quite easily go through the archive and find a piece that said, please match me with that ceramic, because we're made for each other. It's only one instance, I think, in which I saw the photograph first and then bought the ceramic, and that's the Karatsu plate and the seascape. And also that connection was a no-brainer. I mean, they were just made for each other.
So we're talking about a plate by Tokusawa Mitsunori, and the plate is entitled here, Sea Spray Breaking on Rock. This is done in northern Kyushu in an area called Karatsu, which was originally settled by Korean potters. The glaze that's on this piece is referred to as Chosen Garatsu, which means specifically Korean Karatsu. And it is composed of white ash glaze that's actually made from rice straw. So white straw ash glaze. And when it comes into contact with iron glaze, there's sort of a blue streak that is like the ocean actually coming in between rocks right at the shoreline. The rest of the plate is covered with a beautiful, dense, dark iron glaze. We've moved onto the western end of Honshu at this point to a potting area called Hagi, which was also established by Korean potters working under the direction of a feudal lord. Hagi is considered to be, along with Karatsu, one of the top teawares used by tea masters across Japan. They say often number 1 is Raku, number 2 is Hagi, and number 3 is Karatsu. So we're looking at a piece by an artist who comes from a family that goes back 14 generations, I believe, to the end of the 16th century, early 17th century, the Miwa family. This is by Miwa Kazuhiko, who on May 15th of 2019 inherited the name Miwa Kyusetsu the 13th. And he is working with this beautiful unctuous white glaze that is a hallmark of the Hagi style in the 20th century. Earlier examples of hagiware tend to have more of a pinkish glaze or even a buff glaze that's a little bit closer to Korean style, but this white glaze was mastered through artists learning to reduce oxygen in a kiln and produce this very snow-white glaze that is referred to sometimes as snow on cherry bark as the clay behind it becomes very dark with firing. Gordon, can you talk a little bit about what drew you to this particular piece of hagiware?
Well, the glaze is so compelling. It just demands your attention, and the contrast with the dark background. And the shapes were quite impressive. The mottling at the bottom you see of lots of squiggly kind of things between glaze and background. I have a tea bowl, a Hagi tea bowl, which is same family, covered with that, and it's called the Brain of the Devil. Hagiware is very porous. So this is a vase, but you really cannot put water in it unless you season it. So the potters have made a beautifully constructed copper insert that you put inside, and then you can put flowers. I think this family had a large exhibit in Tokyo of many, many things of this size. They, a certain sense of reverence, put in toilet plungers instead of flowers.
Miwa Kazuhiko is known for having studied in the United States. He studied in San Francisco. He was a big fan of Peter Voulkos, and he was also a fan of the avant-garde Sogetsu school, founder of flower arranging school, Teshigahara Sofu. One thing I wanted to point out about your collection, because you just mentioned flowers, is that a large percentage of works in your collection are utilitarian rather than being sculptural. Can you talk just a wee bit about why you're drawn to utilitarian pieces in particular?
Well, I think I was nurtured by Mingei kind of values. The first time these were shown were at the Mingei Museum in San Diego, which put together a beautiful exhibition of my collection. And the functional pieces, of course, are part of the Mingei movement. I just feel myself drawn to functional pieces. They seem more real somehow. There are one or two non-functional pieces, one of which I cheated. It's sculptural, but I put a glass vase inside so it looks like it's a vase. And I think it's important to have that insight into the Japanese culture that they love to use beautiful objects in everything they do. Their combs, their tableware, their clothes. Being surrounded by beauty is an intrinsic value for Japanese culture.
Yeah, that's particularly pointed out by the Mingei movement. But also I've heard from many ceramists as well as other artisans that they don't feel that their work is complete until it's been used for flowers, tea, or food. Further into Honshu, towards the east, is one of the ancient kiln sites. There were 6 ancient kiln sites that were pointed out by an artist who was part of the Momoyama revitalization, where pieces were being dug up from the earth from the Momoyama period, and it started a sort of renaissance in pottery, especially in the 1950s and 60s. So Koyama Fujio was the one to name these 6 sites, and the first one that we're looking at is Bizen. Bizen goes back continuously to about the 13th century. One of the factors of bizenware is that the clay that is used is filtered repeatedly to get as many of the impurities out as possible. And what that produces is a very dense clay that's heavy and waterproof. Mostly this type of clay is used for its kiln effects rather than being glazed. Here we're looking at 2 completely different works by 2 artists who live in Bizen, one of whom is Yamashita Joji, and he's working with a more traditional approach to bizenware using very filtered clay, wrapped it with wet rice straw, and the straw has left these beautiful orange marks in reaction to the body of the vessel when put in the kiln. That effect was discovered by accident, but many artists have used it over the centuries to artistic effect. So you see the difference in this very tight and well-filtered clay versus the clay that's used by Yokoyama Naoki. Yokoyama digs up clay directly from different rice paddies around Bizen, and the clays come out in different colors depending on where he digs it up. He leaves the impurities in it so that he uses this mixed clay to its full advantage by having sweeping lines of texture run across the vessel. Yet again, the way that he's placed the piece inside of the kiln has meant that the fire has affected the piece in different ways. And so this is a much more radical and contemporary way of handling bizenware. So Gordon, can you talk about some of the specific effects of these 2 pieces that draw you to them?
Well, the one you just spoke about was so compelling because it's so dynamic looking. My first reaction was the similarity to the impasto and the energy, almost manic energy you see in the paintings of Van Gogh. And the colors, of course, are so rich. It's a large object, but at the same time, he softened that scale by this very kind of mysterious and elegant opening at the top. And the front of it is just so blazing. And if you look at the rear, you'll see a much darker side with a little orb, which is, my money, is the moon. So we have the sun on one side and the moon on the other. The other vessel is a great example of this wrapping of the wet straw in the kiln for the mineral deposits. And of course, this was fired in such a way that there was no ash glaze, because he wanted to purely focus on this Hidetake, I think is the word, effect, which is so now popular in Bizen.
We're looking at a long platter by Wakimoto Hiroyuki. Wakimoto came to Bizen specifically to study Bizen-style pottery. He had grown up on an island, a very remote island off of Kyushu called Tsushima, but was attracted to Bizen-ware somewhere in his 20s after starting another career. And he's mastered the Hidetake method that Gordon was just mentioning. In this case, applied to what's called a Botamochi effect. And what happens here is that the entire surface is overlaid with the straw. It's not tied on, so it's loose. And then pieces of firing clay are placed on top of the straw. And those create a sort of elongated circle that reminds people of the Japanese sweets called mochi, and therefore it's called botamochi. Gordon, this piece goes beautifully with a photograph that you've chosen for it. Can you talk a little bit about Wakimoto, what you like about his work in particular, and how you selected this photograph?
Well, again, it was serendipitous and another blessing of Japanese nature. Robert Yellen, a great expert and dealer at Kyoto, had agreed to take me and a friend to drive to visit Kakurazaki Yuichi and Wakimoto, two of the most extraordinary Bizen potters who are both imports from the West. And we were going toward Yokoyama City toward the end of the day, and the sun was setting in the distance, and I said, I've just seen that exact image in these ceramics. It was just uncanny. So it was there, impossible not to see.
You just mentioned Robert Yellen, and I know that you're very beholden to a few dealers in Japan for having guided you through the process of collecting. So can you talk just a second about those people?
Yes, I'd be very happy to. Coincidentally, the two dealers which have been most helpful are both Americans who went to Japan with no thought of ever staying there, but as so often happens, once they got to Japan, they fell in love with it and they stayed. And Robert Yellen, started drinking sake, and so he was holding ceramics in his hands, and he was eventually totally seduced by Japanese ceramics and had articles in the Japan Times and is now an acknowledged expert in all fields. He's wonderful about encouraging new potters, often will take me out to visit them in their kilns. He is just almost a saintly man in this respect. And Robert Mangold, another American, is a dealer in Kyoto, and he deals in all kinds of Japanese artifacts. But he knows of my interest in ceramics, and he finds things specifically for me and brings them to me, which is very, very, very kind, and has resulted in some amazing pieces in this room.
We've moved to another of the 6 ancient kilns. This one is called Tamba. Tamba, like Bizen, uses mostly unglazed wares. There are some recent wares that are glazed, but oftentimes pieces are placed in the kiln to get an interesting effect of the fire on the body of the clay piece. So just at this moment, we're looking at work by Nishihata Tadashi. Nishihata reverse engineered a red glaze, which is very beautiful, that he's used on his pots, but he's also a great master of using ash glaze. It appears from looking at these works by him that he lays them on one side so that the ash glaze can gather on the other side and drip across the front of the piece. Tamba ware is interestingly different from Bizen ware in that it is not filtered as much, so it isn't as dense, and it is much lighter when lifted.
Yes, Tamba is such a beautiful area. It is very agricultural, and to go to Tamba, you have to go to Tamba. It's not on the way somewhere else. This particular potter is very celebrated, so I wanted to meet him. And when I did, I noticed that in his home, he had a kind of a shrine, and I asked Robert Yellen about it, and he said his son, who had grown up to be a very promising young potter, died very early of some kind of disease, and the family had set up this shrine in their home, and this master stopped touching clay for a decade. He finally came back to it, and we're also happy he did. On some of these pieces, you'll see indentations and almost seashells. Those were used at places to balance the object in the kiln. then the glaze effect would be coming from the top. And so that's why those things are there.
Shimizu Keiichi has worked to modernize Tombow ware, so the pieces that we're looking at here are both glazed lightly in fairly neutral tones, so they're not striking, but also hand-built in such a way that the geometry and planes work beautifully together in a sort of three-dimensional manner. As you move around the piece, these planes meet and other flat, opaque areas on the ceramics direct your eye around the volume. How did you find this artist in particular?
From a gallery in Santa Fe, the Touching Stone Gallery.
And what drew you to his work in particular?
Well, it was quite unusual from the other work, and it seemed borderline kind of conceptual in a way. The original name for the show at the Mingei was Nature, Tradition, Innovation, and this certainly gave a strong nod to the innovation side of the show.
Hoshino Satoru is one of the foremost ceramic artists living in Kyoto area right now. He finds himself in the lineage of Sodeisha. That was a group of potters who started in the late 1940s in Kyoto. And by 1948, 1949, they were able to produce the first sculptural work in ceramic in Japan. That took quite an effort because there's such a concentration on utilitarian work that it was extremely difficult for them to break away from that. But finally, they were able to do pure sculpture in an avant-garde style. And Hoshino has worked from this basis. This piece here functions as a vase, but it's really made in it with a sculptural point of view. It's created by having a large snake coil of clay that he'll build up in a ring and then press it all over with his thumbs to create sort of a staccato pattern that runs and changes across the surface. And more recently, he's taken to glazing his pieces. So we compare this piece with a photograph by Ito Taijiro of snow dappling the rock and the edges of a garden on the side of a pond, which looks very much like Kyoto snow that tends to be more decorative than problematic. What is it in particular that you love about this piece?
Love at first sight. If any image is worth 1,000 words or makes 1,000 words inadequate or useless, this is it. I mean, it just stands for itself. It is so sensual, so dynamic, so unusual, so sumptuous, all those things. I love it.
Hoshino Satoru has been voted in year after year by his peers across Japan as one of the top 10 potters making work in Japan at this time. And a second one of these artists on that same list is Koye Ryoji. So in the spirit of Kyoto artists making art, Koye Ryoji seems to cover his vessel, which he has glazed upside down, almost in the manner of an abstract expressionist painting, and further mark the surface to create more different types of textures and directions for the eye to flow. Koye is quite a character. Gordon, have you met him?
I haven't met him, but of course I've had many stories. He's a very idealistic man, very, very anti-war, anti-nuclear power, has actually made artifacts which look like the results of Hiroshima.
It appears that he uses shigaraki clay for his clay body that one can see by the bits of feldspar that have worked their way to the surface. And also one notices around the collar of the piece, the indentations left by seashells, which traditionally have been used to balance or to layer objects inside of a kiln. Since these are around the top, and also because of the flowing glaze that goes from bottom to top, we know that he fired this piece upside down and covered certain parts of the shoulder area to keep ash glaze from gathering on it.
He often will have these two signature markings. There's an X, like Zorro or something. He's a social warrior, like Zorro, and then he often will incise something that looks like a door. And this piece, when I look at it, it's so massive and aggressively massive, it reminded me of a huge artillery shell, which would feed into his feelings about anti-war, anti-violence.
We've moved outside of Kyoto to Shigaraki, another of the ancient kiln sites, also going back to the 12th or 13th century. Both Shigaraki and the next place we're going to talk about, Iga, retrieved their clay from the ancient lake bed of Lake Biwa, which over the millennia has migrated north. So it provides clay for Shigaraki, which is then exported all over Japan. Artists tend to enjoy using Shigaraki clay for the amount of feldspar that it has in it. It also is very watertight. One can put water into a Shigaraki jar and leave it there for a year and it won't go anywhere. Some of the facets of Shigaraki ware that are captured in this piece by Kohara Yasuhiro are, again, this feldspathic clay, which is very heavily covered with ash glaze. And the ash glaze has been allowed to collect in the basin of this strapped basket-shaped sweets plate and form a kind of a green pool. The green often is referred to as a dragon's fly eye, more often when it takes on the shape of a globule of ash glaze. But it matches the color of the dragon's fly eye, which is an emerald green. Another piece by Kohara is a plate with a circular area of ash glaze at the center. And this piece shows one of Kohara's main skills, which is that of being an absolute expert in knowing where to put an object in a climbing kiln so that it receives all of these different effects as the ash and the flame hit it in different areas. Gordon, you particularly like this piece for the pond-like effect of this green area.
That, and I'm drawn to his works. If we go back to the handled basket, initially I was describing this to people. I had said, when you see it, you can't decide whether it's falling apart or forming. But of course, in the Buddhist sensibility, everything is constantly falling apart and reforming. And when I look at the tranquil glaze of the handled basket and this waterfall of gold, I think of Amida welcoming us to the Pure Land.
Iga is the second of the potting areas, which, like Shigaraki, draws its soil from the lake bed of Lake Biwa. One of the heroes of Iga ware right now actually lives in Nara Prefecture rather than near Iga itself. Tsujimura Shiro was self-taught and created a kiln on his family property. His two sons work with him and were taught by him. Yui is his elder son and made a great, beautiful basin here, and Kai a tsubo with very dramatic ash glaze, but it's the piece by Shiro that draws us in the most strongly. This crag-like crack along the front is reminiscent of more ancient Iga wares, particularly the burst bag type of cold water jar that was so popular in the Momoyama period forward. Gordon, please tell us something about your impressions of this Shiro piece. I know that it's one of your hero pieces.
Yes, it is. This was at an exhibition in New York, and I had read a review by Holland Cotter, the preeminent New York Times art reviewer, and he reviewed the exhibition, and he never used the word ceramic once. He only spoke of landscapes. And this is such a dramatic, craggy, facing the Dolomites, mountainscape. Great power, great scale. His sons, I think, are doing wonderful work. Yui, who did the shallower vessel, is very interested in some ancient wares, sui ware, and he's made it a functional piece, quite elegant, by giving it a pinched kind of lotus design, and on the inside, taking shells so it'll catch part of the ash glaze. And Kai has made a classic tsubo with a very, very, very dynamic glaze. A wonderful family. Interesting enough, Mrs. Aono, the owned Ippudo galleries in New York and Tokyo, told me that she's known them for many, many years, that Shiro and his wife moved to Nara after the war when Japan was desolate. He was trying to make some money, and he'd make little ceramics and take them down to the temple sales. Well, they sold. He made more, they sold. And now he is perhaps the most famous Japanese potter on an international scale.
We're moving further east into one of the ancient potting areas called Mino, which has again been making ceramics since the 12th century, but it is most famous for the ceramics that started to be made from the 17th century forward. The work in Mino was particularly inspired by the tea master Furuta Oribe, who was a tea master in the 17th century, who changed the focus of tea wares from wabi-sabi in particular to a more elegant look. And part of that elegance came from the types of glazes that were developed in the Mino area. Oribe glaze, named after him, but perhaps not developed by him, we don't know, which is basically a copper glaze. And then Shino glaze, which is a white, very unctuous glaze, a little different in tone than Hagi, which is mostly from rice straw ash. The Shino glaze comes from a feldspathic base. What we're looking at right now is a great, large, rectangular platter by Ando Hidetake, and we're looking at it in comparison with a photograph of a bamboo grove, because as one looks at the streaks of glaze running across this piece, this copper glaze, one gets the idea of light dappling as it moves down into a bamboo grove that's tightly planted. Gordon, talk a little bit for us, please, about your reaction to Oribe in particular.
Well, I love the color green, die Liebe Farbe, as Schubert said in one of his songs. And of course, it's a color you see all over Japan. This particular piece was on the desk of Robert Mangold, and it bedeviled many potters because it's so incredibly heavy. They didn't know how this got fired without going into several pieces in the kiln. So that in itself made it a very, very interesting piece to acquire. At the Minga Museum, they managed to mount this vertically. So when you looked at it, it looked all the world like a bamboo grove. And Taijiro did not have a photograph that he was satisfied with, so he went down to Kamakura to a famous temple that has a famous bamboo grove and took this perfect photograph, and very, very grateful for that.
A large faceted vase by Kato Yasukage the 14th is also reminiscent of that bamboo grove, and not just for the change of tone as one goes across the surface and the vertical striations, but also the change of color going all the way from a very deep forest green to brown tones, just as you would see as bamboo begins to age. Kato Yasukage had the misfortune of coming up in a family where both his father and grandfather had passed away early, and so he was sent to Bizen to learn how to pot, but then returned to the Mino area to master the Oribe glaze and became the foremost potter in this area, but his life was cut short in a tragic accident on a slippery mountain road. And so the family, yet again, is missing its master.
Yes, this is a particularly jarring and tragic event for people in Japan, which helps you understand the reverence in which they hold artists and potters. He was a young man, incredibly promising, and the last of his family. There's now no male person to carry on the tradition. Perhaps someone will marry into the family and take his name, but when Robert Yellen heard about this, he said he could not sleep for the entire night. He was so grief-stricken.
We've moved into Tokyo. Like Kyoto, artists in Tokyo can do whatever they want. Some artists will work with a style that they particularly enjoy, and in the case of Higashida Shigemasa, he does like Mino styles, so he works with both Oribe glaze and Shino glazes that we will see more of in just a moment. This particular piece, it's a lidded vessel by Higashida. He's managed to manipulate the colors of the glaze so that they move all the way from a yellow to this striking glacial blue that runs down the front of the piece as if it were a waterfall. He concentrates quite a bit on the changing texture around the piece in a fairly organic way through carving.
Yes, the connection between nature and the Japanese potters is so powerful to me. If you've ever seen a waterfall of glacier water, this is exactly what it looks like. It has that kind of pure, almost surreal quality.
There is a platter by him in the exhibition, which also takes advantage of the watery aspects of Oribe glaze.
And the large platter is kind of an example of aerial topography. It looks like you're in an airplane way high in the air, looking down on the Lake District. Remarkable, remarkable.
Matsui Kosei is another artist who worked in Tokyo. Like Higashida, he has to use a gas kiln because wood-firing kilns are not allowed inside the city limits for reasons of pollution and breathing. Matsui Kosei was the great master of his time, and probably even up to this time, of a technique called neri-age, in which different clays mixed with different pigments are blended together layer by layer to create an effect on the surface. And for his mastery of this, Matsui Kosei was named a living national treasure. He did not like to have students because the work that he did required so much concentration that he needed to be in his workshop by himself. And one can see this piece, which I consider to be just the most amazing piece that he ever did, which, like Gordon just said about aerial photography, really looks like a flying aerial shot over islands with water in between, just in the incredible shapes that he's managed. And it just seems like an impossible task to have the prescience to understand how these shapes in this topography are going to come out in the final object.
Yeah, I will never understand how they do this, no matter how many times they try to explain it. To take different colored clays and slice them in such ways and somehow visualize that they're going to come out with this piece showing 80 islands, 80 forested islands. I'll never understand. I will just be worshipful.
When we move north of Tokyo, we get to an area that was made famous by one of the Mingei potters, Hamada Shoji. Hamada moved there to pot because it was already established as a folk pottery. He was working with the idea that it was artists who were anonymous, who did not sign their works, who created objects that had the most internal feeling to them. But he also wanted to move with the modern idea of putting himself into the object, making it part of his expression. So he would sign the boxes. His student, Shimaoka Tatsuzo, became a teacher of many artists, including some artists who had their careers in California. Hamada was the teacher of Kimura Ichiro, who here has done a plate with a Shino glaze, this feldspathic glaze. And next to him on display is a work by Matsuzaki Ken, who was a student of Shimaoka Tatsuzo. And it's interesting to compare the two plates because both of them enjoy this very thick Shino glaze, which in the case of Matsuzaki Ken's piece looks like marshmallow syrup, or as Gordon said earlier, shaving cream that's sort of dripping slowly down the side of this piece. Whereas in Kimura's piece, the Shino glaze is very stationary, looking like melting snow on the surface of a log or something like that. This piece in particular, we can see sort of a yellowish tinge towards the inside of the plate, and that comes from having used food on the plate. The plate has accrued, in this case, what is called aji, or taste. It could translate into English as patina. And this sort of patina is very much appreciated by Japanese collectors.
Well, I buy these things and actually I serve food on them and use them, and people should hold them and have them close and see them and see why they were made and have food on them and see that contrast. Yes, utilitarian means proximity and appreciation. I also wanted to mention, connect into the Ken Matsuzaki piece, the shaving cream Shino glaze. My hat is off to Sue and Bernie Pucker of the Pucker Gallery in Boston. This potter lost his kiln in the earthquake, and they raised money to rebuild his kiln. And they have been great champions of many young Japanese potters.
Hayashi Kaku is a professor at Tokyo University of Arts and Music, and at the same time she lives north of Kyoto in an area near Nikko, the very famous mortuary shrine of Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Tokugawa family. She lives near a beauty site in that area called Kegon Waterfall and did a series of ceramic vessels that evoke that waterfall, and this is one of those. And as one moves around the piece, one can see all the different textures of water and the iron-filled rocks that line the side of the waterfall. The mist sort of collects on the sides of the rocks, and that's shown in areas on the vessel itself that are alternatively shiny or matte in tone. So she's really captured all of the different aspects of looking at this natural site.
You know, just as Japanese literature is so incredibly layered, it's very, very hard for the Western reader to understand it. Even certain geographical locations are heavily layered with history. Keigan Waterfalls is celebrated for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's often a place where people go to write their last perfect poem and plunge into the fall.
Another artist who works north of Tokyo in Tochigi Prefecture is Minagishi Seiko, who has reverse engineered a Celadon glaze with a crackle and mastered it to the point where he can actually stack these crackles upon each other so that when one looks inside of this vessel, he makes vessels in a very simple form. The concentration can really be on the Celadon glaze. So as you look into it, it almost looks like mica, the different layers of mica stacked on top of one another. It's an effect that is only seen, I think, in his work, or perhaps in minor details in other people's work, but he is a true master of this Celadon glaze, which he keeps as a family secret.
And it has this sense of layering and depth, and I was really trying very hard to figure out what kind of a photograph can show you something you can't see because it's being covered up. And then I thought of lichen on rock, which grows over itself and forms these beautiful patterns.
The artist we're looking at is from the Tohoku region, which is not a region that's particularly known for its ceramics, though he did learn initially from a local folk potter. Izumita Yukiya is this artist, and he lives right on the coast of Iwate Prefecture and works with a kind of sandy clay that he's devised himself. He layers the clay using a fairly industrial type of washi, or Japanese paper, that has very long fibers so that it stays together even when it gets very wet. And in his pieces, he can evoke either the tilting of the Earth's surface or waves. And he talks about when he puts these pieces together that he's actually imbuing them with his emotions, and after he finishes making a piece, the tension that he's felt inside of himself has gone into the piece, and he can then leave it alone.
This is another piece which totally drove potters crazy in San Diego. I didn't know the details of his using washi, and they keep asking me, well, how does he do it? I said, I have no idea whatsoever. But does it matter? Just look at it. There's so much tension and energy in this piece that it reminds me of the kind of the seismic forces we see in an area prone to earthquakes. The other piece that he has here, which has a more of kind of a torn plain, looks like collapsed earth. This is the innovation guy. This is the innovation side. Incredible vision. And when he was here, someone spoke to him about the tribulations he'd suffered from the earthquake. And that was kind of the first time I understood Shintoism, because he said, it's just part of what happens. And I'm just so grateful I can be here to be part of it. Very moving.
There is another piece by Izumita-san that's in the front window, and that piece actually appears to be springing upward as if it were taking flight, but with a very strong texture, both inside and out, that catches the light in very interesting ways.
I wanted to give a little nod, or maybe a big nod, to women potters, of which there are several in this show. There is a very, very elegant piece from a gallery in Tokyo by Yoko Imada. It's these plains of deep, deep blue and porcelain white. It's so elegant. And then there's this strange shouldered vase by a young potter named Satomi Noda. She came in with some objects, and Robert Yellen said, oh, well, I like those. And so he started helping her to sell them. And at some point, I think he asked her, where did you get your idea for this appearance? She said, without blinking, oh, no, it's moss in the water on white stone. At the beginning of the show, you'll see a lidded box, a very, very dark piece with gold and silver bamboo leaves. And it's just for all the world like bamboo leaves have fallen into a still, dark pond. The connection between nature and these works is just so clear and so moving to me.
One of the leading women artists in Japan, whose sculptural piece is on display here. She does do vase forms sometimes, but this is a piece of sculpture that's reminiscent of a sea animal. She works in Kyoto and is a professor of art at one of the art schools there, and her name is Kishi Eiko. She works with such an amazing mosaic style of constructing that is done with a shigaraki body overlaid by little tesserae of clay mixed with pigments to create the surface that's variegated. And her interest is in how the light plays across that surface. She's enhanced that here with overglazed metal pigment that we've described here as gold, but it doesn't look gold in color, it actually looks almost platinum.
Yes, yes. The non-functional piece, which I don't usually buy, but I just couldn't resist it. It's like a little dancing girl. It's so charming.
And the shadow that comes from the perfect lighting that was done by Shibayama Kentaro, it sort of extends this piece down and outward and helps you understand the dynamic facets of the sculptural form itself. Many of these pieces are going to be coming, thanks to Gordon Brodfuehrer, to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and they will be put in future displays there. So this is not the final chance people will have to see these objects in the Los Angeles area. Many thanks to Gordon Brodfuehrer for that.
Many thanks to Hollis for putting this show together, for her scholarship, and for the poetry of her soul. It's been a wonderful situation. These pieces have never looked so good. The Japan House did an exemplary job of staging it and lighting it.
So as we've moved across Japan from west to east, we've seen that different potters take advantage of the clay of the area in which they're working, and also take inspiration from the type of environment in which they're working to create these works. Kilns that were active from the 17th century forward in Kyushu and the western end of Chugoku have an aspect of Korean style to them, of which the artists in those particular areas are still very proud of. The areas around the Kansai region where Kyoto is and reaching into Chubu all serviced Kyoto, which was the artistic capital of Japan from 794 to 1868. Yet the artists of Kyoto have a lot of freedom to work in whatever style they please. And then as you go further eastward, you have artists that are working as individuals, either in Tokyo or in the provinces to the north, particularly ending with the work of Izumita Yukiya, whose work is inspired by the seascape right in front of his studio and has that quality of sand to it that comes directly out of his environment.
We've made this trip from the far south, from Kyushu, up to the north of Tohoku, and each time we started with the ocean, with the Karatsu waves crashing, and with Izumita's energy in his waves too. So kind of wraps up our nature-surrounded, beautiful Japan. At the end of the show at the Minga, I had to come up with some kind of a statement, and what came to me was a quote which is on the wall of the exhibition here, which reads that the combination of inspiration from nature and craft that goes almost beyond human endurance has been very moving to me, as I hope it has been to you. Thank you.